On a sunny afternoon in the serene town of Maplewood, Sarah found herself grappling with her car's stubborn seatbelt. Her trusty old sedan had served her well over the years but was now beginning to show its age. The buckle refused to release, leaving Sarah half-seated and increasingly frustrated. Just as she was about to give up, Marcus appeared in her driveway. Marcus was her late husband Liam's cousin, a familiar figure who had always been around but never quite this present in her life. "Need a hand?" he asked with a grin that seemed to hold a mix of amusement and genuine concern. Before she could answer, he stepped closer and leaned into the car. His fingers brushed against hers as he worked to free the buckle, sending an unexpected jolt through her. The casual banter that usually marked their conversations was replaced by a charged silence. Marcus's confidence as he worked on the seatbelt only added to Sarah's growing awareness of him in a way she hadn't felt before. When the buckle finally clicked free, Marcus leaned back, his face close enough to hers that she could see the faint stubble on his jawline. "There you go," he said, his voice softer than usual. Sarah managed a weak "thanks," her legs trembling slightly as she stepped out of the car. The moment lingered longer than it should have, both of them sensing the shift but unsure how to address it. As Marcus walked back to his truck, he turned and gave her a quick wave. "Let me know if you need anything else," he called out. Sarah nodded, watching him drive away, her heart pounding in a way that left her both exhilarated and confused. For the first time in years, something, or rather someone, had disrupted the steady, predictable rhythm of her life. That evening, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of Marcus's closeness. She replayed the moment in her mind, wondering if she had imagined the tension or if it was something real. It wasn't like her to dwell on such things, especially not when she had spent the past 3 years building a life for herself and her young daughter after Liam's untimely death. Yet, here she was, her thoughts spiraling into territory she wasn't prepared to explore. By the time she went to bed, Sarah had convinced herself it was nothing. Marcus was just being helpful, as he always had been. But deep down, she knew something had changed. It wasn't just the seatbelt or the proximity. It was the way his presence lingered in her mind, filling a space she hadn't realized was empty. She drifted off to sleep, Sarah resolved to keep her distance. Whatever she thought she had felt that day was surely a figment of her imagination, a fleeting moment of vulnerability. After all, she reasoned, life was complicated enough without adding Marcus into the mix. But even as she made that decision, a small, insistent part of her couldn't help but wonder what it would mean if she didn't. The next day, Maplewood's annual community gathering at Willow Creek Orchard brought together neighbors, families, and old friends. The crisp autumn air was filled with the scent of apple cider and freshly baked pies, and the buzz of cheerful conversation echoed through the orchard. Sarah arrived with her daughter, Mia, hoping to enjoy a peaceful afternoon and perhaps distract herself from the previous day's encounter with Marcus. However, fate had other plans. As Sarah walked through the crowd, she spotted Marcus by one of the cider stalls, chatting with a group of mutual acquaintances. He caught her eye and smiled, a gesture so simple yet disarming that Sarah's pulse quickened involuntarily. She returned the smile, hoping to mask her nerves as she approached. "Hey, Sarah," Marcus greeted warmly. "How's the car holding up?" "Still running, thanks to you," she replied with a laugh, though her voice felt unsteady. Their exchange was light, but there was an undercurrent neither could ignore. Throughout the afternoon, they kept crossing paths by the caramel apple stand near the hayrides, and even at the pumpkin patch. Each time, their interactions grew increasingly charged, the casual touches and lingering glances speaking volumes they were too afraid to articulate. At one point, as they both reached for a slice of pie from the dessert table, their hands brushed again. Sarah froze for a moment, caught off guard by the electric spark that seemed to pass between them. Marcus withdrew his hand slightly but didn't step back. "Looks like we have similar tastes," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Sarah's cheeks flushed. "Guess so," she managed, avoiding his gaze. She couldn't deny the connection that had been simmering beneath the surface, but acknowledging it felt like stepping onto a path she wasn't ready to walk. By the time the gathering ended, Sarah felt emotionally exhausted, her mind racing, with conflicting thoughts. Marcus's presence had stirred something deep within her, something she couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore. That night, as she tucked Mia into bed, Sarah's thoughts drifted back to the orchard. She remembered the warmth of Marcus's smile, the way his hand had lingered just a second longer than necessary. Lying in her own bed, she replayed their moments together, feeling both drawn to and wary of the emotions they evoked. Was she overthinking things? Or was there truly something growing between them? Sarah didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear. Her carefully constructed world had been shaken, and she wasn't sure how to steady it again. As she closed her eyes, the memory of Marcus's gaze stayed with her, a quiet reminder of the unexpected turn her life seemed to be taking. The morning air in Maplewood carried the scent of dew and the distant aroma of roasted coffee. Sarah was in her kitchen, sipping on a lukewarm cup, her mind still tangled in the events of the orchard gathering. She was startled by a knock on the door. Opening it, she found Marcus standing there, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand and a sheepish smile on his face. "Thought you might need a refill," he said, extending one of the cups toward her. Sarah hesitated for a moment before taking it. "Thanks. You didn't have to." "Consider it an apology for taking the last slice of pie yesterday," he replied, his grin disarming. Inviting him in felt both natural and dangerous. They settled at the kitchen table, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the space between their words. Their conversation started light discussions about the weather, Mia's school projects, but there was an undercurrent of something unspoken. As the minutes passed, Marcus leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" She tensed, her fingers tightening around the coffee cup. "Sure. Are you okay? I mean, really okay?" His tone was gentle, but it pierced through her defenses. Caught off guard, Sarah looked away. "Why would you ask that? Because you've been carrying everything on your own for so long? Liam's gone, and you've had to hold everything together, but you don't have to do it alone." The words hung in the air, both comforting and unsettling. Sarah felt the familiar tug of vulnerability, the urge to push him away before he got too close. "I've managed just fine," she replied, her voice firmer than she intended. Marcus didn't back down. "I'm not saying you haven't. You're incredible, Sarah. But it's okay to let someone else be there for you, too." Her heart raced, caught between the fear of letting her guard down and the pull of his sincerity. She searched his face, finding no trace of judgment, only understanding. "I don't know how to," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to figure it out all at once," he said. "Just let me help, even if it's small things." Simplicity of his offer was both comforting and terrifying. It wasn't just about fixing broken seatbelts or bringing coffee. It was about stepping into a space she had carefully guarded for years. For the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself to consider the possibility of letting someone in. She didn't know where it would lead or if she was ready for the consequences, but in that moment, she chose to let Marcus stay a little longer. The morning stretched into hours, and their connection deepened with every shared word and silence. For Sarah, it was a tentative step toward something she wasn't yet ready to name, but couldn't ignore. One crisp evening, Marcus suggested an impromptu drive to Crescent Lake. It had been years since Sarah had visited the serene spot, a place that once held countless memories of family picnics and fishing trips with Liam. The idea stirred a mix of emotions, excitement at the thought of revisiting a cherished place, and unease at the notion of sharing it with Marcus, whose presence had become increasingly complicated. The lake was as picturesque as she remembered, its surface shimmering under the glow of the full moon. The old wooden dock stretched out into the water, inviting them to sit and take in the quiet beauty of the scene. Marcus carried a thermos of hot cocoa, and they settled side by side, the sound of gentle waves providing a soothing backdrop. "I used to come here with Liam all the time," Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her voice wavered slightly, betraying the emotions she worked hard to contain. "He loved this place." Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the rippling water. "He did. I remember the first time he brought me here. He was so proud of catching that massive bass. Swore it was the biggest fish anyone had ever seen." Sarah laughed softly, the memory warming her even as it stung. "He exaggerated. It wasn't that big." "Maybe," Marcus said with a smile. "But it meant something. To him, this place, these moments, they meant everything." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Sarah turned to face him, and in the moonlight, she saw the sincerity etched into his features. For the first time, she noticed the depth of his eyes, the way they seemed to hold years of memories and emotions she hadn't allowed herself to see before. "Sarah," Marcus began hesitantly, "I need to say something, and I don't want you to feel pressured, but I can't keep pretending this isn't there, this feeling I have for you." Her breath caught and she looked away, her heart pounding. "Marcus, You don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I know it's complicated. Liam was my cousin, and I would never want to disrespect his memory, but I can't ignore how I feel when I'm around you." Silence enveloped them as Sarah grappled with the storm of emotions his confession unleashed. Part of her wanted to push him away, to protect the fragile world she had constructed in Liam's absence. But another part, a quieter, braver part, was drawn to the honesty in Marcus's words. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I don't know what to do with this, Marcus. I'm so confused." "I understand," he said, "but I needed you to know." A single tear slipped down Sarah's cheek as she turned back to him. In a moment of vulnerability, she reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. And when their lips met, it was like the breaking of a dam, years of grief and longing spilling over into a single tender moment. It was both exhilarating and terrifying, shattering the walls she had spent so long building. As they pulled apart, Marcus searched her eyes. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said. Sarah nodded, knowing there was no turning back. The lake bore witness to their fragile beginning, a connection that promised both healing and uncertainty. For the first time in years, Sarah felt the possibility of something new, and it both thrilled and terrified her. As the weeks went by, Sarah found herself caught between two worlds: the life she had carefully built in Maplewood and the forbidden intimacy she was developing with Marcus. The house felt smaller with each visit, the walls closing in on her as her guilt twisted into something more complex. She knew that her neighbors were whispering behind her back, their eyes sharp, their curiosity insatiable. And yet, in the quiet moments with Marcus, it felt like they existed in a separate reality, one where no one could judge or disrupt their fragile connection. Every stolen glance, every touch of his hand as he passed her something, set her heart racing, despite the suffocating weight of the secret they were nurturing. Marcus, for his part, seemed to walk the fine line between tenderness and restraint, his presence a comfort and a reminder of the boundaries they were edging ever closer to breaking. But for Sarah, every day became an internal battle, a constant tension between desire and duty, love and loss. She wasn't sure how much longer she could carry the weight of her divided life. She wanted to trust Marcus, to believe that what they had could be something real, but the consequences loomed large in her mind. Would it all unravel if someone found out? Would she lose everything she had worked so hard to protect? And still, every time he left her house, there was the unspoken promise that he would return, that the fragile thread they were holding on to wasn't completely severed. Yet as the days turned into weeks, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something, sooner or later, would break. The question hung in the air, a quiet but powerful presence that Sarah couldn't escape. What did she truly want? It was a question she had spent years avoiding, too busy with the obligations of life and the expectations of others to stop and reflect on her own desires. But Marcus's patience, his quiet understanding, had begun to unravel the walls she had built around herself. It wasn't the first time he had asked her what made her happy. At first, his question had been almost a passing thought, something casual, as though he wasn't truly expecting an answer. But each time he asked, there was a softness in his voice, a sincerity that made her feel safe enough to entertain the thought. "What makes you happy?" he'd said one evening as they sat together on the couch, the soft hum of the streetlights filtering through the window. The question had lingered long after their conversation had ended, echoing in her mind like an insistent whisper. What did she want? Was it the life she had built, the one that was safe, familiar, and rooted in the expectations of her family and community? Or was there something more, something daring and unknown that she had been denying herself? For years, Sarah had lived in the shadow of what was expected of her. She had married young, built a home, had children, and maintained a life that, on the surface, looked perfect. She had met all the benchmarks of success that society had set. And yet, inside, there was a quiet discontent that she had never quite been able to place. She had sacrificed parts of herself, the parts that craved excitement, passion, and true connection. Now, with Marcus's steady presence, something had shifted. He had a way of seeing her that few people ever had. He didn't look at her as a wife, a mother, or a neighbor. He saw her as Sarah, the woman who had dreams and fears, desires and hopes. He made her feel valued not for what she could do for others, but for who she was. That feeling, that recognition of her worth, was something she hadn't realized she was missing until it was given to her. Marcus's kindness, his willingness to listen without judgment, had cracked open a door she had kept shut for so long. And now, as she thought about him, about them, a sense of clarity began to form. She had never asked herself what she wanted, not in the truest sense. She had always been too afraid of the judgment, the consequences, the potential fallout of living a life that was anything other than what was expected. But now, with Marcus's gentle challenge, she found herself wondering what it would feel like to embrace that question fully. What if she could let go of the fear and step into a future where she was seen, valued, and loved for exactly who she was? What if she could choose happiness, even if it meant going against everything she had known? It wasn't an easy decision, and she wasn't sure she was ready to make it yet, but for the first time in years, Sarah felt the possibility of something more, something real, something of her own. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, but the question, the one that Marcus had planted in her heart, would not let her rest until she found the answer. The turning point came on a Thursday evening when Marcus casually suggested a weekend trip to Pinewood Cabins, a quiet retreat just outside Maplewood. The idea seemed both exhilarating and terrifying to Sarah. Her first instinct was to decline. There was too much at stake, too many eyes watching her every move. But as she stood at the window staring out at the quiet street, something inside her stirred. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to step outside the confines of her life, to experience something different. It was a risk, no doubt. But wasn't that what Marcus had been asking her all along? To risk living a life that was truly hers, free from the expectations and the judgments of others? Sarah didn't know if she was ready, but the thought of retreating into a space where no one knew her, no one was waiting to pass judgment, felt like the first breath of freedom she'd taken in years. After much internal debate, she agreed. The moment the decision was made, it felt like a weight lifted from her shoulders. There were still many unknowns, but there was also an undeniable sense of excitement that she hadn't felt in a long time. When the weekend finally arrived, they drove to Pinewood Cabins together, the miles of winding roads cutting through the heart of a forest that seemed far removed from the everyday. The quiet of the woods wrapped around them like a blanket, and Sarah felt the tension in her body slowly begin to loosen. The cabin was small but cozy, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. There was no cell service, no distractions, just the rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional chirp of distant birds. The world beyond seemed to fade away, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Sarah could just be. There were no roles to play here, no expectations, no demands. It was just Sarah and Marcus, two people connecting in a way that felt both natural and unspoken. They spent the days cooking together, something Sarah hadn't done in years. The simple joy of chopping vegetables, stirring a pot, and setting. A table felt grounding, as if they were creating something together that was entirely their own. Marcus was patient, guiding her in the kitchen with a gentle humor, and Sarah found herself laughing in a way that felt new and freeing. There was no pressure to be perfect, no measuring up to anyone's standards. It was just them, savoring the small pleasures of a simple life. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars appear one by one in the dark sky. They shared stories from their past moments of triumph and loss, dreams they had once held and those they still hoped for. For The first time in ages, Sarah felt like she could speak her truth without fear of judgment. In Marcus's presence, she didn't have to be anyone other than who she was, with all her flaws and complexities. The weekend passed in a blur of quiet, moments and stolen glances. Each one was a reminder of what she had been missing: a life of connection, of living fully in the present, unburdened by the weight of past expectations. When they returned to Maplewood, it was with a renewed sense of clarity. Sarah wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it on her own terms, no longer afraid to ask herself what made her truly happy.